All right. So friends, I'd like to welcome you back to the digital lectures here under the care of Dr. Aaron Ziegel from Towson University. I don't want to take up too much of his time, but I did want to thank Aaron for continuing to do these for us. We find them so valuable, and this is way better than right before the show when you should be out for dinner having a nice glass of wine. So thanks for getting us learned up early.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And thanks everyone for choosing to spend some time with me this evening. I appreciate you joining me here online this Thursday. And also, as I always do, I'll say hello to those of you watching in the future once the stream gets recorded and posted up to YouTube. So thanks for taking time to tune into that as well. Back to Turandot. And again, I say it with the T. I gather that the production says it without the T. And we'll leave that one as an argument to be had for another time. I want to begin tonight at precisely the same place where I ended last class. That is, considering how this opera holds a very unique and important place as the ending point for the long lineage of Italian opera. This is indeed the latest composed Italian opera to have entered the standard repertory. There are plenty of other operas in Italian after this, but none of them in the core repertory of opera production. And as we noted at the end of last class, looking at this fascinating commentary from the American magazine Musical America, even at the time, it was recognized that this marks something of an ending. The writer notes that there was no new figure on the horizon, giving promise of equal or similar gifts as a melodist. He calls Puccini the last of the melodists. Clearly, the focus here is on writing good tunes, something that Puccini is, of course, the great master of, the kind of thing that has kept this opera and Puccini's other works so alive in the repertory. You can get a sense here that there is a concern on the part of this writer that modern music is departing from melodic composition, that modern music is perhaps abandoning that core element that has been at the center of, well, Italian opera, but really much opera in general throughout its history up to this point in the early 20th century. There is fear that we're not going to have tunes to sing, and all you have to do is look around to other operas from the early 20th century, and you can probably count on one hand how many of them pervasively make use of predominant melody-forward writing. There's lots of lyrical singing in early 20th century opera, but prominence of melody, maybe not so much. So this all makes Puccini seem like he might be doing something that is relatively old-fashioned, relatively retrogressive, or perhaps even backwards looking. But the argument that I'd like to make at the start tonight is this, that for Puccini, this opera, Turandot, is the product of a mind that has been keeping very up to date with modern music, very much looking into the styles that are emerging around him, studying those models, even if they're models that he does not wish to follow, still finding what elements of these contemporary styles can he take into his own work. And thus, it is possible to understand Turandot as an exemplar of what Puccini imagines modernist, still melodic, and still tonal Italian opera might be. We see Puccini here as not a composer at the tail end of his creative life, even though in actual historical fact he was at the tail end of his life. We see Puccini here instead as someone who is very much keeping up to date with trends and finding new possible directions. And to give us a glimpse into his mindset at this period, this is the period in which Puccini is seeking pathways into modern music, seeking pathways to keep up to date, to keep up with his contemporaries. We find a striking letter from the 5th of November, 1918. So this dates us a couple of years before he has latched on to the idea of using the Gozzi Turandot play as subject matter. That is still in the future, but at this point we find a more or less elderly Puccini who, despite his age and long career and great success, feels like he is still in the prime of his life. He writes this to his close friend, perhaps one-night stand lover, but longtime correspondent and one of his closest musical discussants when he had projects at work. He always wrote to Sybil Seligman about them. So this is what he writes to Sybil. "I'm nearly 60, dear friend." And 60, I think, now is lots younger than it was back then. For Puccini, he is thinking he is really quite old. He says, "I'm nearly 60, dear friend. How unjust it is that one should grow old. It makes me simply furious. Confound it. And to think that I won't surrender and that there are times when I believe I'm the man I used to be. Illusions, and also a sign of strength," he thinks. So again, this is not a composer who is struggling to find the energy for creative action. This is a composer who is eagerly pursuing opportunities. This eager pursuit of opportunities is evident in the fact that throughout his long career, he maintains a very close engagement with up-to-date, cutting-edge trends in modern music. Now, this slide is going to be a massive name drop of famous early 20th century modern composers, and it is remarkable at how many of these most important musical figures of Puccini's time he overlapped with, knew personally, encountered, and engaged with their music. So we'll start in 1892, relatively early in Puccini's career, the first time that he meets Mahler. They would continue to cross paths for many years, and Puccini closely studied Mahler's symphonic output as it came. In particular, Mahler's Symphony of 1000 is one that certainly Puccini had in the back of his mind when writing the very grand, very large-scale choral scenes that occupy significant portions of the runtime of Turandot. In 1902, we know that Puccini studied the score of Claude Debussy's Pelléas et Mélisande. In 1906, Puccini attended a production of Richard Strauss's Salome, and Strauss would remain very much at the forefront of Puccini's operatic thinking throughout his career. Indeed, Puccini considered Strauss to be his only real, evenly matched competitor in the entire operatic world. So anytime Strauss had a new opera, Puccini, if he could not get there to see it for himself, certainly made a point of studying the score. In 1911, Puccini meets Stravinsky for the first time. He had attended a performance of Stravinsky's brand new ballet score, Petrushka, and just 2 years later, Puccini himself is present in Paris for the very famous, notorious even, world premiere of Rite of Spring, the performance of Rite of Spring at which the audience rioted and the police had to come in to restore order. Puccini was sitting next to Debussy for that performance. Later, in Italian opera history, in Italian musical history, I should say, Puccini takes much interest in a young contemporary newly on the musical scene in Italy, and that is Ottorino Respighi. We know Respighi for his Roman trilogy of tone poems, The Pines of Rome, Roman Festivals, but the first one is Fountains of Rome. And Puccini is known to have been very impressed with what his younger contemporary was up to. This is the same Puccini who was regularly dismissive of things that his Italian competitors were up to in his music, so it's notable that he liked what he heard from Respighi. In 1920, again, he is in the orbit of Richard Strauss, where he attends the premiere of Die Frau ohne Schatten, one of Strauss's largest, most complex operas. And here's the most remarkable one of all. Schoenberg was in Italy for the Italian premiere of Pierrot Lunaire. There is a work that is clearly without melody, as far removed from the expressive tonality and memorable tunefulness of Puccini as you could possibly imagine. And yet, Puccini was very interested in the new techniques that Schoenberg was innovating with. Schoenberg, for his part, was quite flattered that this great master of Italian opera, Puccini, would be in attendance for this performance. Schoenberg saw to it that he put a score of the work into Puccini's hands so that Puccini could follow along with the score as the performance unfolded. And they had lengthy conversations after this work, at which Puccini was quite interested to discuss Schoenberg's new methods of composition. So all of that, again, taken in total, shows Puccini as a composer who is entirely up to date with the contemporary trends of music happening around him, seeking to understand them, respecting what his counterparts are doing, even if he does not necessarily choose to imitate those styles. He is learning from them and trying to put the fruits of that learning on display in the opera Turandot. Now, that may have been what Puccini thought he was doing, but that doesn't mean it was necessarily perceived that way. So again, we've got this sort of, depending on which way you wish to rotate the object, Puccini as a traditionalist, the capstone of an era, or alternately, Puccini, a modernist, keeping up with trends and trying to demonstrate his viewpoints on those trends through his works. But again, not everybody necessarily understood it that way. One of the chief critics of Puccini's style of opera writing is the musicologist Fausto Torrefranca. This is musicology almost before it exists as a discipline. Torrefranca was of noble ancestry, and he seemed to derive some notoriety for himself, I should say, through the publication in 1912 of a short monograph called Puccini and International Opera. He means this title, International Opera, as a derogatory phrase. He accuses Puccini of not staying true to distinctly Italian models, but instead drawing his inspiration internationally, and at the same time, not pushing forward enough in a modern way. This attack on Puccini was enough for Torrefranca to land himself a very important university position. And let's look first at what Torrefranca had to say about Puccini, and then secondarily, what Puccini had to say about Torrefranca. This is what Torrefranca writes. In Puccini, the truly personal search for the new is absent. He applies, does not discover, works cautiously on what has already been done, assimilates from the French and Russians, from the Germans, and from his Italian contemporaries, and in applying, he never succeeds in broadening what he has learned from the others, but uses it as a common ground of modern music, consecrated by success and given value by fashion. Puccini is thus the manipulator par excellence of international opera. This is like the least charitable view you could possibly have on what Puccini is doing with his musical style. It suggests that Puccini is simply borrowing from others, not pushing the style forward in new directions. And to be frank, this is absolutely misunderstanding of the trajectory of Puccini. Puccini in the works that he is active with in the 1910s and Turandot in the 1920s is showing a composer who is very much trying to find new ways to keep the genre moving forward, even if he never abandons tonality and never abandons the importance of a good, singable, memorable melody. So for Puccini, for his part, surely was aware of this pamphlet, and in all of the extant writings, he appears to make note of it simply one time in one passing comment in a letter to a friend where he writes this, 1915. Have you read our dear Torrefranca? He deserves a good beating. So, a very confident move there, I think. And it tells us something, too, about the success of Puccini in the operatic realm, that he could afford to take this kind of critical attack. So, enough for Torrefranca. I want to next turn our attention to another way in which Puccini is trying to seek out new sounds and new styles, again, from a modernist angle. And so I want to explore the ways in which Puccini has tried to make this opera Chinese. Now, from our 21st century point of view, we can, if we so wish, read Turandot as a very problematic opera. It is built upon Chinese stereotypes. It is built upon not particularly deep of an understanding of Chinese culture, despite the research that Puccini and his collaborators put into it. I would, however, argue that this is a misunderstanding of what it is that this opera is trying to do and trying to be. It's very easy for us from our safe, comfortable 21st century vantage point, where we know all kinds of more enlightened things about cultural relations, to apply our standards to how people from a century ago should have been thinking about these things according to us. And so I want to spend some time again interrogating this issue of the Chinese nature of what Puccini has accomplished in this work. First of all, we should think about the source material. As I explained some in the previous class last week, we talked about how Puccini and his librettist collaborators are working from a plot initiated by the playwright Carlo Gozzi, but they did not have access to Gozzi's original. They were instead working off of an Italian translation of Schiller's German translation. So they're 2 steps removed from Gozzi's original. But it is still, though, important to note what Gozzi thought about the setting of this play in historical legendary China. Gozzi's description of the play that he called Turandot is this. He called it, quote, a fairy tale, one of those stories which grandfathers and wet nurses entertained the children on a winter's evening by the fireside. So this is first and foremost a fairy tale opera. That is to say, it is not meant to be taken as a literal depiction of any actual time and place. The characters are not meant to be understood as necessarily exemplars of any kind of person that ever actually existed. These are fairy tale characters. We're in the realm of fantasy here. We're in the realm of imagination. And if we keep that idea in mind, that these aren't necessarily real types, but rather something that is a deeper truth, a truth about human experience rather than a truth about how an actual person might have experienced something, then I think we get a lot closer to what it is that this opera is trying to accomplish. So Gozzi calls it a fairy tale, and the librettists are careful to point out that this story is set in legendary times. The quote there, in Peking in legendary times, is how the librettists themselves labeled the setting and the time period of this story. Yes, it is a real city that actually exists in the world. They use a former term, they use Peking, but by identifying it as in legendary times, you'll notice that they are not identifying an historical era or an historical period. For instance, all you have to do is look at any other Puccini libretto where it is very specific about what century it takes place in, what the city is, who these characters are populating it. It is all very real, with the exception of this one, in legendary times. They're adapting Gozzi's fairy tale. And thus we read in the stage directions for the opening of the work, this. We see on stage, quote, the great wall, the walls of the great imperial city. The massive ramparts enclose almost the whole stage, broken only on the right by a great loggia, all sculptured and carved with monsters, unicorns, phoenixes, its columns supported by the backs of massive tortoises. At the foot of the loggia, held up by 2 arches, is a gong of very sonorous bronze. Peking, which slopes away in the distance, sparkles golden. The square is filled with a picturesque Chinese crowd. Now, one of the things that Puccini would often undertake when composing a new opera is some research into musical source material that might help to place his opera in a distinctive sound world unique to the setting of the story he is enacting. For instance, in Madama Butterfly, the quoted use in passing of the melody of Our Star-Spangled Banner shows that it is an all-American production, and it identifies the Americanness of some of the characters involved there. Notice that this is simply through the referential nature of a melody, not a stylistic idiom, not a body of tunes, but usually just single borrowed melodies. And where do these borrowed melodies come from? Well, Puccini's research, if we can even call it that, is usually targeted very narrowly, just to give him enough to inspire his creative juices, just to give him enough material to work with. And so I start with this stage direction because it is fascinating to see the ways in which the imagery that the authors of the libretto are evoking are closely bound up with the source that Puccini used to reference and to research his imaginary ancient China. We'll skip over that quote for the time being. In 1920, when Puccini has settled on the idea of using La Turandot as his subject matter, Puccini writes to one of his librettist collaborators, Adami. He writes this: "I will find ancient Chinese music and information and pictures of various instruments, which we will put on stage, not in the orchestra." So a modernist radical experimenter composer, which again Puccini is not, might have chosen to use the sounds of actual historical Chinese instruments. Puccini is very clear that is not what he wishes to do. He wants them instead for the look. And it is a look that he is attracted to because of the fact that it is essentially part of an imagined China, not necessarily a real one. This is a fairy tale. This is a fantasy. This is in legendary times. So he wants something that is evocative more than he wants something that is authentic. These are two very different concepts. So where is he going to go to find the ancient Chinese music and the information and the pictures? Well, we know from the documentary evidence and from Puccini's library that he had access to this book, a book published in the city of Shanghai in 1884 called Chinese Music, written by the author J.A. von Alast. In this book, one finds notated music examples from which Puccini extracted precisely 4 distinct melodies used throughout the score. But most importantly, though, this book is also a source of the iconographical imagery that inspired and populated the stage design that Puccini's designers were working with. We'll get to this source in just a minute. Because it is of public domain and it is of historical importance, it is digitized and easily accessed online. So if you're interested to check it out for yourself, you can go to the Internet Archive, archive.org, and look up Aelst Chinese Music, and it'll take you right to it. We'll get into some key pages from the book in just a moment, but there is one other source that deserves mention in passing. Just by chance, Puccini, in conversation with one of his friends, a baron named Fasani says, "Oh, you're doing a Chinese opera. Well, I've got something that might interest you." And Fasani pulls out a music box that had originally come from China. And he winds it up and he plays the tune to Puccini. Puccini is captivated enough by the sound that this random chance encounter with a music box owned by one of his friends also provides a more or less authentic Chinese melody. So in total, that yields 5 different melodic shapes that are quoted from actual Chinese folk song. So let's open up Chinese Music by J.A. von Aelst. We see that Aelst was the Inspector General of Customs. So this is in the midst of European colonialist history when officials like Aelst were sent abroad to manage the affairs of the colonial relationship, and many of these individuals, because they frankly had too much free time on their hands, took it upon themselves to study the culture of the place they were at, and it is out of a study like that that this book by Aelst is published. 1884 is the date. So Puccini is thus working with a source, and apparently the primary source that he turned to research Chinese music, a source that is a quarter century old by the time he's working with it. So here's one illustration that appears in this book. We read in the stage directions about a loggia. Well, there's the arc shape of the typical facade of a loggia structure in Italian architecture, and surely recognizing the similarity between those arches seen on this Chinese building and the common Italian loggia balcony. This surely attracted Puccini and his designers to this image. We also see this, indicated in the description as a Chinese bell tower. The book, by the way, is published in English, I should note. This idea of a bell or a large gong being a central feature of the stage picture surely is derived directly from sources like this. We know that in the opera Turandot, it is the gong that one rings to signal the taking up of Turandot's challenge to try to answer her riddles. In fact, Act 1 of the opera culminates with the unknown prince finally committing to going up and making the fateful decision to ring the gong. And so this idea of a gong on top of a tower, we see right in that illustration. There are also interesting illustrations of gongs and bells and chimes like this, suspended on the backs of mythical and legendary animals. Again, in the stage direction, we read through all the different mythical animals, the legendary animals. In the original stage direction, these Chinese food dogs are turned into tortoises. Perhaps they were just looking for something more familiar to Puccini's Italian audience. So what do we read? A great loggia, all sculptured and carved with monsters, unicorns, phoenixes, its columns supported by the backs of massive tortoises. Again, we saw all of this imagery. A gong of very sonorous bronze, we saw that imagery too. So the core ideas of what this opera should look like are found in the illustrations of this book by Aelst. To prove the point, examine, if you would, this illustration. This is the scenic design made in 1924, the initial sketch for what the stage design for Act 2, Scene 2 should look like. And if I go back a few slides, compare this building, the Hall of Classics, where ceremonies are occasionally performed, so says our legend. And then if we go forward to the scenic design, well, the look of that structure is there, centered in the image, duplicated again on the other side. It is a hall where ceremonies are performed, and well, what ceremony is unfolding during Act 2, Scene 2? This is the ceremony in which the unknown prince is challenged to answer the riddles. Did my sharing go away? Some people say I'm not sharing. Can somebody else confirm that you are still seeing my screen?
And see.
Okay, so I'm not sure where that comment came from. I just wanted to check since somebody put it in the chat. Thanks for that. All right, so we've seen the iconographical evidence from this Aelst source. For Puccini, though, as composer, it is the musical material that is a more important source. Again, we know of 4 distinct melodies that come from this book, and I'd like to take us now through a comparison between what it is that Aelst transcribed from actual Chinese folk music into his publication, and then how Puccini adapts that material into his composition. Because it is not as simple as just borrowing the melody wholesale. Puccini is still very much thinking and working like a composer. This is simply the raw material that he is then adapting into his own function. So, in Aelst, we find this. The following air is exceedingly popular in North China. It is entitled Mama Hao Ming Pai. Oh, Mama, you understand me well. As I've noted, and as you can see on the screen, this is a book in English. It is true that Puccini did know some English, given his collaborations with the playwright David Belasco, given his commissions for the Met. Whether he actually read this book is debatable. It seems like he's mostly looking at the pictures and looking at the music on the page, and so it's not like he's chosen this for any specific symbolic reason because of the text of the song. It is simply a melody that catches his interest, and a melody that he thinks will have compositional function and utility once he adapts it. So I've pulled my piano close to me right now, and what I'm going to do is play through this melody. so that you can hear what it sounds like in its original form. I'll move the mic a little closer to the piano. And this is what we hear. All right, catchy little bit of writing there. It is in a pentatonic scale, as you might expect for a Chinese tune. It's got some rhythmic impetus. It covers a nice lot of range. It's not an unmemorable melody. It's easily singable, hummable tune. So you can see why Puccini might have been attracted to this for his compositional language. In its adaptation, this is how the melody appears in the opera Turandot. Our excerpt comes from the first scene of Act 2, and let me play for you first on the piano the melody that Puccini composes himself out of bits and pieces drawn from that Chinese folk song that I just played. So this is Puccini's melodic adaptation. Every bit of that melodic shape comes from the tune in Ale's book, but Puccini has manipulated it quite significantly. So let's next listen to how this appears in its fully orchestrated form in this scene. The melody is not sung, rather it is part of the orchestral accompaniment underneath the character of Pong, who is singing here. Let's listen. You'll hear it primarily in the woodwind instruments. It's an oboe doubled by trumpet, alternating with an English horn doubled by trumpet.
Io preparo le nozze ed io le seghe e rosse lanterne.
There I clicked something I shouldn't have. Let's start that over and try once again.
Io preparo le nozze ed io le seghe e rosse lanterne di festa, le bianche lanterne di lutto, l'incensi e le offerte, monete di far adorate, il bel ballantino strarrante ben fatto, i bonzi che cantano.
So we heard that melody twice over. Puccini loops it. Notice what he has structured here. He has structured a very evenly balanced phrase built of 3 parts of 4 bars each. 1, 2, and 3. It's a very balanced melody. It is frankly a very European phrased melody. In contrast, the melody in its source form, 1, 2, 3, 4 bars for that phrase, but then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 for that phrase, then the last phrase, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Everything is uneven, of all different lengths. For the kind of regular orderliness that a European balanced melody like this should have, Puccini needs to excavate his pieces, so to speak. So from this long, irregularly phrased Chinese folk tune, Puccini draws 3 key fragments. Now I'm going to play the music example again, and this time when each of these melodies occurs, I'll put a bracket over the notation of the Chinese folk song so you can see where the source is coming from.
Io preparo le nozze ed io le seghe e rosse lanterne di festa, le bianche lanterne di lutto.
So he extracts the parts of the tune that he finds most melodically interesting. He seems pretty attracted to the idea of that dotted rhythm, which we find pervasive in the first segment, but then not present at all in the second segment. But he likes that dotted rhythm, so Puccini repeats it. Since he's extracting essentially 3-bar segments, or rather 2-bar and a beat segments for both 2 and 3, he needs to extend them. He adds extra repetition. He makes the ending cadential notes last longer. So we see that Puccini's incorporation of his quoted Chinese material is really much more sophisticated than just quoting a folk melody. He is using it as a jumping off point, as a starting point, which then his composition grows out of. So we'll hear the second half, the second repetition of it one last time. So I've been listening to that enough over the past few days that I've got that one stuck in my head, and apologies if that happens to you too. But it's a pretty catchy tune. You've got to give Puccini that. It's got good taste in terms of what to select. So we've seen his Chinese elements, or at least the ways in which Puccini is seeking to incorporate Chinese elements into his score. And in the context of the 1920s, the inclusion of melodic inspiration, shall we say, drawn from the folk music of another culture, of a very distant culture, is in fact quite a modernist approach. If modernism is all about seeking new sounds for musical composition, well, an Italian composer drawing inspiration from Chinese folk music certainly counts as one of those new sounds. But this, of course, is not the only modernist element. Remember my list of people that Puccini was in contact with: Mahler and Debussy and Stravinsky and Schoenberg. Well, here are the modernist traits that Puccini adapts into his own writing. We find, particularly in Turandot, but also in other late Puccini works, that he is making much use of dissonance from non-functional harmonies, that is to say, chords that don't behave like the regular triads of functional and common practice theory. One thing that Puccini often does is that he'll have a portion of the orchestra playing what is a normal functional triad, but he will accompany it in the bass with pitches that are entirely unrelated to that triad. So it's sort of a combination of two normal-looking things happening simultaneously, which yields a very new and different sound. This is related to a practice of composition known as bitonality. Tonality meaning music being in a key, bitonality thus being music in which more than one key is being played simultaneously at a time. This likewise yields a very dissonant sound world. Two tonalities happening simultaneously will yield dissonance. Puccini, in this opera in particular, is interested in using unusual and non-diatonic types of scales. And so we find Puccini working with, of course, the pentatonic scale, but also other shapes of scales that are different than just the regular standard major or minor scale. Another element that is specifically related to Chinese music and other types of musics from the Asian continent is a texture known as heterophony, or a heterophonic texture. Hetero meaning different sounds texture. In a heterophonic texture, what happens is that multiple instruments will be playing essentially the same melody at the same time, but each different instrument will have their own independent decorations or ornamentations or variations of that melody. So it's sort of like the framework is the same for everybody, but the specifics of the shape that hangs on that framework is going to be different for each of the players. In Chinese music, for instance, this is generally an improvisatory practice, multiple solo instrumentalists improvising around the same melody at the same time. For Puccini, of course, this is a fully notated, composed practice. Turandot is especially noted and has received much study in the academic literature for its orchestration, for the ways in which Puccini uses instrumental timbre to heighten the atmospheric nature of this drama. This is one of the most sophisticated handlings of the orchestra that we find anywhere in Puccini. And partly this is made possible by the fact that in its full form, Puccini calls here for massively large instrumentation, including instruments that are somewhat atypical for him as a composer, and an especially substantial percussion section. And so it is worth taking a look at the instrumentation list as called for in the full score. Remember who Puccini's circle of inspiration is. Mahler is a part of that. Richard Strauss is a part of that. Think about, say, Mahler's Symphony No. 8, the so-called Symphony of 1,000, which uses a massively gigantic orchestra, or perhaps Strauss's opera Elektra. That is the one that used the largest orchestra that Strauss ever used. It needs somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 musicians to pull it off adequately. I don't believe that that many fit in OperaDelaware's pit, but let's take a look at how Puccini lists things in the score. In the woodwind section, there on the left side of your screen, we see pairs of woodwinds, flutes, oboes, clarinets, and bassoons, but then also all of the, I call them bonus instruments, the ones that are different sized than the standard. So to our two flutes, we add a third flute and a piccolo. We add an English horn, a bass clarinet, a contrabassoon, thus reinforcing every contingent of the woodwind section. In the brass, more modest numbers, nothing too particularly outrageous here, at first glance at least. 4 horns, 3 trumpets, 3 trombones, and bass trombone. So that's your standard Romantic era brass section. More unusual, though, is the percussion array that Puccini's score calls for. On the left, a long list of unpitched percussion instruments: timpani, triangle, various drums, various gongs, tam-tam, and then a number of pitched percussion instruments: glockenspiel, xylophone, bass xylophone, tubular bells, celesta, 2 harps, and an organ. This is not a cheap orchestra to hire, by the way. Now, I said that at first glance the brass section seemed relatively modest, but again, in Puccini's full conception, his score also calls for an offstage contingent of brass musicians. They are not to be seen. They play from behind the scenery. And this contingent includes, quite unusually for the time, really unusually for the orchestra of any time, we start with 2 alto saxophones, 6 additional trumpet players, 3 trombones plus bass trombone, and even some additional percussionists to play behind the scenes too. And then on top of that, of course, your full complement of orchestral strings. So this is a stunningly large, intense orchestra, but all chosen because of the fact that Puccini wants to give himself the widest array of orchestral colors that he can possibly imagine. It is a great advance in that regard on other scores in Puccini's output. So if so much of this is showing Puccini keeping up with trends and being at the forefront of modernism, even while retaining tonality and tunefulness, I think perhaps the most useful way for us to view the score that Puccini has composed here is to see it as a perfect commingling of modernism and tradition. Puccini has found a way to strike a balance between trying new ideas, keeping up with contemporary approaches of his time, incorporating advances that his contemporaries are making, while at the same time very much acknowledging the importance of the Italian tradition that he is a part of. He's doing this, in my opinion, to set a model for how the Italian opera composers that follow him might do that. Thus, it is, in hindsight, something of a sad truth that there was not any obvious successor to Puccini waiting in the wings. We'd had such a nice logical progression from Rossini, who knew and respected the young Verdi and saw Verdi as his successor. Verdi, in his old age, knew Puccini and saw Puccini as his logical successor. And yet here's Puccini in Turandot showing the path forward for a true to the history and legacy of Italian opera work that still draws upon modern traditions, and yet there is no one to carry on that legacy successfully into the repertoire to come. Puccini lays out the perfect model in Turandot, however. To illustrate some of these elements, then, of style and tradition all coming together into one, I'd like to point out some things that are at the background of the formal structure of the first act of this opera. To make this point, I need to start by laying out the main events that occur in Act 1. And we can break it down essentially into 4 key chunks of plot that occur in Act 1. At the beginning of the act, we hear the proclamation read aloud by the Mandarin, as he is called in the libretto, proclaiming that Turandot will not marry unless a suitor can answer her 3 riddles, and only if the suitor correctly answers those riddles will the suitor survive, because the penalty for not answering the riddles is death. And it is in the midst of this proclamation being issued that we have the entry of 3 unknown exiles from the kingdom of Tartary. We learn that Timur is the king of Tartary in exile, that he is accompanied by his slave girl Liu, who is attached to the family because she had previously helped to save the king's life. We don't know too much about the circumstances of that, but that is what the libretto tells us. So the characters come on the scene. This is our first segment. The second segment is at nighttime. The moon rises, and we hear the funeral march for the Prince of Persia, a prince who attempted Princess Turandot's challenge, failed to answer the riddles correctly, and is thus being led to death. Turandot comes on stage. She sings nothing until Act 2. All she does here, however, is issue the death sentence. Next scene, or next segment of plot, I should say. The emperor's 3 ministers, Ping, Pang, and Pong are their names, appear, and they urge the unknown prince. We know his name's Calaf, but that name does not appear anywhere in the libretto or the score until he finally reveals it to Turandot at the very end of Act 3. So the unknown prince is urged by the 3 government ministers not to take up the challenge of the riddles, but of course he is not persuaded. Liu, the slave girl accompanying the king of Tartary, pleads for the prince to relent. He replies that she must care for his father, Timur, even if he loses his life through failing to answer the riddles, and the act then concludes and culminates with a scene where, against all reasoning, the unknown prince strikes the gong. So there's our 4 segments of plot action. Now, these 4 segments can be laid out across the formal structure of the act in the following pattern: a slow introduction leading to a faster allegro, a slow andante section corresponding with the moonrise, a grotesque scherzo section corresponding with the entrance of Ping, Pang, and Pong, and then finally a slow-tempoed finale in which Liu pleads for the prince to resent. He replies that she must care for his father, and then he strikes the gong. The form of these 4 movements in this pattern of tempo is indeed that of the classical symphony. This is not the only time in Puccini's output that he has used symphony form to control the structure and pacing of an act or a scene of music. So this is in fact a standard procedure for Puccini in some instances. Striking to see this fusion of instrumental absolute form like the symphony and a narrative vocal form like opera. Now you may think that it is unusual to end a symphony with a slow movement. Typically finales are fast, but it appears as if Puccini may have had the model of Gustav Mahler in mind. Again, we noted earlier that Puccini was acquainted with Mahler, encountered him on several occasions, studied his scores closely, kept up to date with his symphonic progress, and Mahler, in fact, ends many of his symphonic output, I should say much of his symphonic output, with slow movements. So even this has an important place in the legacy of European classical music. So there's one tradition at the background. Finally, then, one other tradition that is worth examining here is the way in which, despite all of the modernisms, all of the newness, all of the Chinese influence for local color, for exotic color, Puccini never relinquishes hold on his true lineage as the capstone of the Italian bel canto tradition. And so particularly in the finale of Act 1, we find really important resonances of the bel canto tradition. And for our purposes here, we can describe and define bel canto as being an idiom of beautiful vocal singing in which lyricism and tuneful melody is the priority. At the end of this act, that is to say the finale movement of the symphony, we get the first important solo singing for any of our principal characters. We hear from Liu first. She sings a famous aria called Signore Ascolta. To her pleadings to the prince, please don't take on this challenge. If you do, you might die and you'll leave your father alone. To her pleadings, the unknown prince replies, don't cry, Liu. Instead, it must be your duty to care for my father if I fail. Both of these numbers are essentially cantabile-type arias. In bel canto tradition, a cantabile aria is the term used for slower, lyrical, tuneful, and melodic segments in aria writing. We get two of them back to back, one for Liu, one for the unknown prince. These segue then into the kind of finale for which there are dozens and dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds of exemplars in the Italian operatic tradition. That is the so-called concertato finale. In short, a concertato finale is this: put as many characters on stage as you possibly can and have them all sing simultaneously as many different lines as they possibly can and as loud as they possibly can. So after the relatively restrained arias of Liu and the unknown prince, the concertato finale then is the moment where the composer can let all the stops rip. In this case, the concertato finale is essentially a sextet plus the full chorus. Our sextet consisting of Liu, the unknown prince, the prince's father, Timur, the king of Tartary, and then Ping, Pang, and Pong, the three ministers of the government trying to tell the unknown prince, don't risk it, dude. So, with these ideas in mind, let's turn finally to some more extended listening from Puccini. The examples I'll play come from the recent Anthony Pappano recording on the EMI label. This is famously, Antonio Pappano was the first to record the original uncut Alfano ending. This is a recording that came out about a year ago in March of 2023, findable on all streaming platforms and other sales outlets there. I'll put up some text so you can see what is being sung. There it is. And we'll start with a bit of Liu. We don't have time to get through all of this segment, so I'll excerpt from it, but we'll start with a bit of Liu's singing here. Signore Ascolta. So this is almost old-fashioned style of Italian opera writing, but of course what makes it so effective and so emotionally impactful is the fact that this rather old-fashioned type of Italian vocalism is existing within the context of surroundings that are very much up to date modern, contemporary, and trying new things. Next, the unknown prince sings this, his response to Liu. And so forth. So again, in the traditional Italian cantabile style, but ultimately this builds up then to our concertato conclusion. This is the kind of text where so many words, so many lines are overlapping simultaneously that keeping up with what everybody is saying can become difficult. Let's listen now to the finale of Act 1. And this will be a little louder. I see the request to turn up the sound a bit. It's very soft because the rest of the recording gets so loud. Here we go. And so with that, what I've got to say comes to an end. Thank you again very much for choosing to spend some time with me this evening over Zoom. Thanks again to those of you in the future who are watching this played back on YouTube at some time. It's been a great pleasure getting to talk to you about this fascinating opera Turandot. After hearing the end of Act 1, I sure am excited to see it in person. Again, I'll be there Friday evening, so if you're going to that show, I'd be glad to have you say hello and introduce yourselves to me. And we have a few minutes now, so if anybody's got any questions, I'd be happy to address those too.